This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Well, hey everyone, thank you so much for tuning in to When Science Speaks. Today's episode is brought to you by Bayer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists and engineers clearly communicate the real-world impact of their work to investors, policymakers, and the public using true-to-life, proven training in communication and relationship building. I am so happy to have Dr. Brad Thompson with us on the show today. Brad has a really rare blend of expertise and experience that includes scientific training as a Ph.D. in microbiology and immunology, high-level communications and media experience as a TV science explainer-in-chief for the Canadian Broadcast Corporation, the CBC, and as chairman, CEO, and board member of publicly traded companies. Brad is an experienced and highly respected biotechnology professional who's also an inventor of several patents granted or pending in the viral gene therapy area. He's currently serving as chairman and CEO of Avimab Pharma and chairman and CEO of Kickshaw Ventures. Brad has served as director and chairman of Biotech Canada and as executive chairman, CEO, and president of Oncolytics Biotech, Inc. Brad started his career in biotech as head of biotechnology at the Alberta Research Council. He received a bachelor's in science from the University of Alberta and a PhD in microbiology and immunology from the University of Western Ontario. Welcome to the show, Brad. So great to have you here.
Well, thank you, Mark. It's good to be here.
So, as I mentioned in the intro, as a scientist, as a PhD, an inventor, you really have an extraordinary ability to effectively translate complex scientific topics into engaging language that's accessible to general audiences. Not something that we come across that frequently at all. How did you develop this unusual ability? And I also have a question that I want to ask you about a particular, share a particular story, but maybe we just start with this. What are the roots of your kind of dual talents, both on the science side and the communication side?
Well, I started actually doing more of the, what I would think of as public communication side of my life. Back in the early 1980s, I was starting to do space research. I had an experiment go up a couple of times in the space shuttle, STS-37 and STS-43. And I was doing a lot of low gravity aircraft work out of Houston, at the NASA site there at Ellington Air Force Base. And I had to explain that to a great deal of people back in Canada. And it was very unusual in Canada to have somebody interacting with NASA, basically just not as a Canadian add-on, but as a NASA-ite. I had a address in the U.S. I was an adjunct professor at Colorado State University, and they just treated me like I was one of the family. And explaining that back home is when I actually started talking to people about space. But the real kind of how do you distill things down to things that are understandable to usually very intelligent audiences that just simply don't have the content expertise that you're trying to impart to them, was when I started talking to a series of classes that my daughter was in when she was, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, about space and space research and that sort of thing. And I started getting some unusual questions lobbed at me out of nowhere. And that's really when you start honing the art of answering on the spot in a very direct way, distilling it down to not to de-content it, but distill the content down to its primary basic principles in order to get it across to people. And I remember this one when I was young. I was talking about fluid dynamics, which is what I used to do on my experiments on the shuttle. And this kid sticks up his hand, and he was probably 7 years old or something. And he goes, "Could you explain where gold comes from?" I'm like, blah, 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 blah. Okay. That's fortunately one I do know the answer to. But, it was like, okay. And then it just opened up from there. I mean, I just got bombarded with questions that were completely off topic, but were, kind of spacey, sciencey stuff, stellar evolution and, beyond and beyond. And, but that's really when it started getting that sort of thing. And then I started interacting with the media in a lot bigger way. And, I started doing spots with CBC. And I mean, I think the reason CBC was interested in having me do that is that they could call me up at the last minute and say, we need somebody to talk about sinkhole evolution or something like that. And I remember that day on the sinkholes. I mean, I don't know anything about sinkholes, but it's pretty logical about where they come from. And, so I had 3 or 4 minutes to figure out, where sinkholes come from. And I think that's one of the things about science that people tend to forget is that Mother Nature distills things down to the simplest pathway over time. That is just the essence of science. And so when you hear some really convoluted, kind of fuzzy, nebulous kind of explanation, that means we just don't understand the process yet. Because when you actually get down to the final, like we actually get it, it's usually pretty straightforward and pretty simple. Mother Nature takes the shortest path between point A and point B almost universally. And it's always far more simpler than we would have thought it was at the start. And so and if you just take that attitude into communicating, especially with the public, to just go from point A to point B, straight line, and don't take out the content, but keep it just to the point. People seem to get it, and it's also short, which is also a good advantage. But that's where it started. It started with me communicating with small children who are extremely bright. Anybody who treats a small child as if they're not the next generation, integrated circuit that's 10 times faster than you is making a big mistake, because they are. They're fiendishly smart. And they just don't have the software yet. I mean, so think of it as a computer that you haven't installed your operating system on yet, and that works every time.
I just love that. I got to tell you, Brad, that response is just so sharp and insightful. I mean, it's probably expected given your talents, but just that point about Mother Nature and the simplest path is not something you typically hear. Of course, resonates with scientists and the software hardware analogy, which I actually, it's funny because I've used that too as kind of my philosophy on child rearing. You're trying to load that software, as early and as quickly as possible, and make it as difficult to uninstall as you can.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember. My daughter teases me about this now. Is that the reason she didn't really get into science wasn't that she wasn't good at it, because she was, or good at math, which she's fiendishly intuitive about. It's because I wanted her to do that. she turned her back to it. But I remember going out and teaching, kind of just not teaching her, but kind of working through the process about how to figure out how tall a tree was down in the street, when she was 3, using math and stuff like that. And she just said, yeah, it was easy, Dad. I got it. But, you were so interested in it. I just, so
something else.
Yeah.
Apply that brilliance somewhere else, which is good too. I want to ask you now, talking about applications, how you use that translator skill in your role as a CEO and as an investor. And as an inventor too, talking, you're innovating, and you've got to share that, this discovery with others who, are just learning about it for the first time, for example.
Yeah, well, and the CEO and investor roles are really mirror images of each other. I mean, I did tens of thousands of presentations to investors, like literally. Again, my daughter and I sat down one day. She said, "How many presentations have you made?" And I'm like, "Why are you asking me these questions?" And so we figured it out. And at that time, it was like 22,000 presentations, and so you're presenting to investors. And then on the other side, I mean, those, being a full-time investor in biotech is a daunting task. You have, maybe 8 or 10 companies a day that are presenting to you. And then on top of that, you have to do all the due diligence and post diligence and all the rest of that stuff. But it's all very micro focused on a very narrow range bit of science and technology for each company. That's usually fairly unique for each company. There's not a lot of Me Tooism going on in biotech.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, it's a daunting task to communicate to that person, that investor who's got that basically tsunami of information coming in companies, and to not have them just kind of lose the thread 6 seconds after you walk in and talk to them. There's I will remain unnamed firm in New York where the head guy in the firm is famous for getting up and walking out in the middle of meetings. And the investment bankers time how well the meeting was how long you lasted with fill in the blanks name at the meeting. And the first time I presented to him, he sat through the whole 45 minutes that we had scheduled, and the banker jaw was hanging down. And we walked out the door and he goes, I've never seen him sit through a whole meeting before, ever. And I've been presenting to him with companies for 15 years at that time. Mm-hmm. And I said, why do you think that is? And he goes, it's because he was getting what you were saying, you know? And I was like, okay, but that's just communication, right? So when you're as a CEO, I mean, you're communicating, especially as a public company, you're communicating primarily with investors who are either institutional investors or retail shareholders. And I tended to treat them both the same. Most of the retail shareholders in biotech companies actually are very concerned and focused, and actually do quite a bit of homework normally. So they're usually very informed, and so if you treat them like an institutional investor, you're not going to be far off the mark. But again, the real thing there is to keep the message short, keep it concise, and keep it to the point, and try to explain. You know, my challenge to anybody who comes and asks me, you know, when they're doing pitch decks, what they should do, and I'm like, don't spend more than 3 slides on your technology. That's it. You've got 3 slides, and make sure there's not a lot of words on each slide. You know, I don't want to see, you know, 1-point font
right
filling the page just so you can get it onto 3 slides, which people coming out of academia have a great deal of trouble adjusting to it, and naturally so. I mean, because they're expected when they do grant proposals to go to the other extreme. You know, it's 3,000 slides. You know, describe your technology in 19,000 words or less, and they're like, oh, how am I supposed to do that? I'm used to doing it in 100 words or less. You know, so and I'm going to sound like, you know, Charlie Munger here. If I can't explain it to somebody in a paragraph, then I've missed the mark. But so the 3-slide rule in a pitch deck for your technology part, and your pitch deck shouldn't be more than 15 or 16 slides long in total, which gives you, you know, a slide for your IP, a slide for your management, 3 slides for your technology, an intro slide, a finish slide, the disclaimer slide. I mean, it's pretty standard stuff, but it's good discipline in communicating, because that means you can communicate the message in anywhere between 9 to 12 minutes, and that's an important number, because that's usually the attention span of somebody who's trying to pay attention to you. If they're not trying to pay attention to you, it's 3 minutes. So as a CEO, you got to have those rules in your head, and that's the thing. On the other side, as an investor, I look for that too. I mean, I look for the same criteria that my investor colleagues do. They see a lot of material. I mean, I see a lot of companies. I mean, it's not my prime area of business. I mean, I see a lot of companies, and you need to be able to get through it quickly, get to the point quickly, and get to the point where you decide whether there's actually something investable in there. Mm-hmm. And as you know, any advice that I have for CEOs presenting to investors is also to make sure that you show them how you're going to make them money. That is why they're investing in you. It's not a charity ball. It's not, they're giving you money so that you give them more money back.
Right, exactly. And so, you kind of touched on this, Brad, but, my next question goes to, why it's so challenging for many scientists to do this, to distill and clearly communicate their work. You kind of talked about the different kind of cultures, when you're applying for a federal grant, you've got 19,000 words, and you think that's not enough. versus you're the first person in 15 years that, he's ever sat through a whole presentation for. So, being able to make that shift perhaps is part of the issue, but, you've been on both sides of this. So, I'd love for you to share with our listeners sort of why you think it is so difficult for many scientists to do that, and perhaps maybe advice that you have for listeners, who want to sharpen their skills in this area.
Yeah, that's a big question, isn't it? I think, I mean, when you look at all the certainly the PhDs that end up as CEOs in biotech in particular, but there's a lot of them everywhere else. I mean, that is your training. You come through an undergraduate, plus or minus doing a master's, and then you do a PhD. And so you've got anywhere between, a minimum of 7 years to up to 15 years of time spent in an academic environment where people are kind of doing micro picking at what you do in a very, very often aggressive way. I mean, academia is a very aggressive place to be when you're coming up with new ideas. It's brutal, and so that's what leads to people coming up with very long, detailed, fine-tuned ways of trying to communicate what they're doing to people, because they have to defend it. Whereas when you're flipping over to our side of the page, people just either they believe you or they don't believe you, and they invest in you because they often just have confidence in you. I mean, if you have a track record of making money for them, that's a very short conversation.
Mm-hmm.
If it's the first time that they've seen you, it's a longer conversation, but not that much longer. And they tend to make up their minds on an investment decision very quickly. And it doesn't require all that fine-tuned kind of pick at it stuff. But making that transition is extremely difficult. It's very, very difficult. I mean, sometimes I end up kind of losing the thread and getting very professorial, which leads to me enjoying the sound of my voice a little bit too much for long periods of time. And if I'm fortunate, my daughter who works with me is on the call, and I'll get this text going, like, shut up, or something not quite that polite,
Sure.
but which I'm happy with. I'm happy to get prompts, but it's a very difficult thing, and it's hard to look at somebody and give them a roadmap to make that transition. I think failure at communicating is probably how most people, including myself, learned. You missed the mark, and no pun intended with this conversation, and you missed it, and you have to kind of go home and retool and figure out why. Now it helps to have somebody that can listen to what you said and give you some advice on that, which I'm happy to do to people. And I was fortunate that I had people who were happy to do that for me too. And it's a little delicate sometimes, though, telling somebody that they're long-winded and missing the point. People don't like to hear that, and there's nice ways of putting it, and there's usually the way I put it, which is not nearly as politically correct, but which explains my daughter. She's even less politically correct about it. It's obvious. I mean, I'm smitten with my daughter because she's way smarter than I am. She's way more articulate than I am. Her command of the English language is unbelievable, and the nuancing of specific words is exquisite. And I've learned a lot from her, actually, about communicating, which is nice. But you have to be willing to learn, and you have to have having somebody who's willing to comment on it, and you have to, I think, learn from your failures. That's really, I don't think it's that complicated.
Right. Yeah, I guess that was one of the things that I was thinking about when you were responding is there an underappreciation for how difficult it is,
Oh, absolutely. It is turning basically an academic way of communicating into a either public motif. I mean, you're doing a 30-second slot on Good Morning America, you better make sure you have all your content in 30 seconds. Or to an investment group of people who, would be just as happy to play on their cell phones as they would be to listen to you.
Yeah.
It's a difficult transition, and it's a very difficult job. And it's probably the most important job that somebody that's aspiring to be a biotech, in my case, or IT or whatever. It doesn't matter which milieu it's in. It's really probably the most important transition skill that a senior executive, whether the CEO, the CFO, the COO of one of these companies can make, because they're all expected to communicate to larger audiences in concise and to the point manner. It's probably the most important job skill they can learn, and it's possibly the most difficult.
I just want to stop for a quick second. I'm hearing a little bit of a tap at some, not really a tap, maybe like are you hearing anything on your end? Almost like a shuffle at some points in the conversation?
Oh, I think I was playing with my glasses. I apologize.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, I'll make a note for the production guys to see if they can reduce that. But
yeah, okay.
You're okay. Then we'll.
There's me being professorial with my half glasses.
Yeah, no problem.
Like playing with them. They are now out of reach.
Okay,
So
got it. Yeah, no, this is great. This is really great. Okay, so we'll go in 3, 2, 1. And Brad, you've been a leader in the biotech space for more than 30 years, and I'm wondering if you can share with us your perspectives on how the industry has evolved, since the early days when you were just starting out.
It's a very different industry. When I started, and I'm dating myself here, right after I started was when Genentech went public.
Mm-hmm.
With DNA as their trading symbol, which I will always remember. And it was like, and at that time, I don't know if you remember, there was a front page of, I think it was Time magazine, where there was somebody holding looked like about a 50-liter Erlenmeyer flask. They had their arms around it, and it had basically the world's supply of interferon in it, which was valued at that time at over $1 trillion. And I was like, and that's what biotech was like then. There was like 2 or 3 public companies. Very quickly, American Genetics, which has become Amgen, was just starting up then and just about went bankrupt, which people tend to forget about before they became very successful. But it was a very different, the tools were primitive compared to what we have access to now, but they were like space age, cutting edge at the time. But from a product perspective, people tended to focus on products that were already naturally occurring compounds in your body. So interferon, you make interferon. You and I are both making interferon right now as we talk. Amgen was looking at, the very first product of Genentech was human growth hormone. Then they moved on to the interferon. Then you move on to, Amgen with EPO and things like that. They were all natural occurring compounds in your body. They just had to figure out how to make them outside and add more of them back into you. It was almost a guarantee of having a product work, because obviously the product did something because you made it. And you just kind of figure it out. But it was a very tight-knit community. You had Biogen and coming out later, and Cetus originally first with a lovely little whale symbol, which I've always been attached to. And you can literally list the companies off of on your hands. And the industry just about was stillborn. It came so close to cratering at the very start because little hiccups or big hiccups affected everyone. It was like, if somebody else made a mistake, the entire industry would die. Mm-hmm. And, there was an early focus on sepsis, for example, which, was like, the ultimate tilting at windmill Don Quixote thing, because sepsis we still don't know sepsis, and it just about killed the industry. There was a dozen high-profile failures in sepsis very early on. So the first antisense clinical study just about killed that area too. They enrolled a bunch of patients on day one. They did one of those, you do your whole phase 1 study in one day, 3 different dosages, morning, noon, and afternoon, not waiting to see. And the patients all seemed fine. And then they went into a phase 2, and they were about halfway through the phase 2. And all the phase 1 patients had liver failure and died.
Yeah.
Oops. And so they halted the phase 2. They were doing prophylactic liver transplants to try to save the phase 2 patients. That didn't work either. So like every patient in the study, I believe, died. That just about killed that area. That's what early biotech was like. And then you evolve out, and now you've got thousands of companies. Probably at least 1,000 of them are publicly traded. They're looking at every aspect of human physiology, and we're not doing very many natural, first generation products anymore. There's very, very rarely do you see somebody come out with, "Oh, I'm just making more of what you already make." And so you've got it's just, the science is just so different, but the industry is so different. We are, virtually all the products that come out of big pharma actually have their origin in biotech. I mean, we're the discovery engine for the pharmaceutical industry. Some of the companies go on to be fully integrated companies, the old FIPCOs, and some don't. And so things are just, it's interesting to see the evolution of this industry. It'd be like talking to somebody who had been around during Standard Oil's days, and then got to hang out until Hughes came up with a proper drilling head, which is where he made most of his money from, which people tend to forget. The man was a genius inventor and flamboyant, but a genius inventor. It's interesting to see what's happened with this great industry. I'm obviously a very large proponent of our industry, and I'm very proud of it, the way it's responded to this, latest COVID thing. There's government money lubricating parts of it, but there's hundreds of companies working on therapies for COVID that have no government involvement whatsoever. That they're just putting up their own money in their own time, suspending basically their commercial, probably not a big commercial opportunity, but are trying to come up with something. And it's oddly collegial. I'm talking to a lot of people. We have a COVID project too going, but it's oddly collegial in that companies are basically talking to each other like they're colleagues back in university again,
Right.
About everything. So it's a wonderful industry to be in. I'm proud to be in it. It's one of those once in a forever opportunity to be in industry, because 100 years from now, biotech won't be biotech like it is now.
Well, actually, that's where I kind of want to go with this next question, Brad, is, what advice do you have for listeners who may be conducting research in an academic setting right now, but are interested in a career in biotech?
I think that probably 90+% of the people who get trained at a university in life sciences right now are going to end up in the industry. There's a diminishing number of academic positions out there, and there's a diminishing amount of funding out there. I mean, I think most of the good science, if you're interested in doing good science and being able to just follow your nose and do what's interesting to you, you're going to have a much better chance of doing that in a biotech company than you are in a university, unfortunately. Because you don't get to follow your nose anymore in the university system. You just don't. Whereas in biotech, all you have to do is convince, whoever you're reporting to that this may vaguely lead to something wild and interesting and exciting on the commercial side, which is not too difficult to do in biotech. So, I think if you want to continue to do science, I would go into a biotech company rather than stay on university. If you want to be, do more than science and be commercial orientated, then you have to go into a biotech industry. It's really, I would also advise against people, going and getting a PhD and then going and getting layer upon layer upon layer of other training because they think they need it to be in a company. I think an MBA is a good, solid investment. Honestly, I think a law degree is as good an investment in a basic understanding of business than a business degree is. So I could take the route my daughter took, and she did a law degree. She didn't want to be a practicing lawyer. She wanted to have the fundamental understanding of our legal system, which, how valuable is that?
Right.
So I think it's just getting out and kind of doing it and being allowed to do it, which is the hallmark of our biotech industry. Anybody can start up a biotech company. My daughter and I have started 11 in the last 3 years. And all looking at different things.
Mm-hmm.
All it takes is going down and incorporating the company and kind of heading off from there. It's not that simple, but it's almost that simple. It's an area where 1900 entrepreneurism in oil companies would be completely, you know what you were doing, except the area is different. So obviously I'm a big fan of that. And we do a lot of contract work with universities because they're good labs, and they're always shocked at how little direction we give them. I'm just like, yeah, do good stuff in this area, please. Look at checkpoint molecules or whatever it is.
Uh-huh.
And they're like, that's it? I'm like, yeah, that's it. Just come up with something exciting to surprise me for it, please. And they're just not used to it.
Uh-huh. Fascinating, really interesting. I want to shift gears just a little bit, Brad, and ask you, you and I had a chance to talk offline about the mountain of misinformation that is out there about coronavirus. And, clearly some of it could cause severe physical damage, death, but these more prevalent probably is these lies and misrepresentations, which are confusing the public. And there are a lot of false narratives out there about the origin of the virus, of course, have a lot of consequences. Testing capacity of the US, just a lot of information out there that just is not true. And what I sort of see as I look at this situation is a real collision between the scientists and the experts and the others who really, spent their careers working on infectious diseases and public health, and that collision between the experts and the politicians who do not have anywhere close to that kind of background and have other interests and other priorities that they're concerned about. And I'm wondering, for our listeners and others who are thinking about how can we set the record straight, how can we counter this flood of falsehood and deception, even in small ways, in their immediate circle, but just to get your take on that, how can experts respond to skeptical audiences or individuals who are really holding on to things and believing things that simply aren't supported by any kind of data or evidence?
Yeah, and this, I think, is going to be a textbook case. If there is ever, a much overused expression, this is a textbook case. But I think this is going to be a textbook case of miscommunication. And we had everything we needed to know. Oops, sorry. I'll start that over again. I think this is going to be a textbook case of miscommunication. We had literally everything we needed to know to respond to this particular event coming out of China, all in about 2 paragraphs. It's terrible for China to have to be the first country to deal with this. First is worst when you're dealing with a outbreak of an unknown disease. But we had the basic information from the Chinese before it became an issue here that would have allowed us, if it had been communicated properly, not just to politicians and the general public, but to the medical community too. They're not scientists. They're not infectious disease experts. Medical doctors are experts in when you get a disease. They're not experts at disease transmission, nor why should they be? Your typical MD maybe gets a dozen hours of infectious disease lectures as a student, and they're there to treat disease. when you've got coronavirus infections, that's when doctors, that's where they prove their worth. You know, you wouldn't want me intubating you, or but they're not transmission expert. You know, they don't have the transmission expertise, and so there was a failure of communication with some very basic principles that came out of China very quickly about this disease to our medical community, our politicians, and the public. The message was not transmitted. I mean, when you think about what came out of China before it was a problem here, we knew it was a coronavirus. Now, that's all I needed to hear. I mean, literally, as soon as they said it was a coronavirus, I could have given you a response from a disease transmission perspective. And I'm not particularly unusual. I mean, well, I'm unusual, but I'm not unusual in this way from an expertise perspective. There's lots of people who have more expertise in this area than I do. But as soon as I heard it was a coronavirus, and the reason why we knew that's important is something that was also not transmitted. Just under half of common colds that you get all the time are seasonal coronavirus infections. Like, most of mankind has had a coronavirus infection already. Okay, they're not that different from each other. So yes, there was SARS, you know, SARS-1, because we're starting to call this one SARS-2. There was, you know, which had more effect in Canada than it certainly did in the United States because it came through Vancouver and into North America. MERS, which again hasn't had much impact unless you're in the Middle East, which is transmitted, you know, from camels. So, you know, unless you're running around the Australian outback or in the Middle East, you're not going to get MERS. But they're both coronaviruses, and you have all the seasonal coronavirus. So as soon as I heard it was coronavirus, we could have told anybody who knows about coronaviruses could have said, okay, how it's going to be transmitted is either by contact. So, you know, you got to be distancing yourself, and by aerosols. You cough it up and it's an aerosol. And honestly, there's more stuff known about aerosol transmission of viruses than you and I could talk about in 5,000 years. It is being, the science of that is like old and exquisitely detailed. I mean, it's spot on. So we knew without knowing anything about anything else, we knew how it was transmitted, and we knew what to do about it. So you don't touch each other, and basically the classic way of dealing with it isn't to isolate the planet from the person coughing, it's to isolate the person coughing from the planet. So, I mean, if you were giving people advice about it, you say, if you've got a sniffle or whatever, you wear a mask and you isolate yourself. Yeah. And for everybody else, just don't touch each other in public. Yeah, there. That's what the advice would be for at least the transmission side. The second part that was beyond the coronavirus was, what are the patients at risk? The patients at risk coming out of China was pretty much defined. I mean, they came very quickly. I mean, I know people have been criticizing them for, you know, waiting 3 weeks or whatever, but that's, I don't think there's a government on this planet that wouldn't have tried to basically pretend it wasn't happening. That's just the nature of governments. You know, by the time it filters up and through, nobody wants to be the source of a worldwide, you know, infection cycle. I mean, nobody does. I mean, the Spanish flu from, you know, this name Spanish flu from World War I, actually originated in the United States. American soldiers took it to Europe, where then it became more prevalent, and then brought it back. Nobody wants to hear that. Of course they don't. Nobody wants to think you're the source of contagion. I mean, who wants to be the city where typhoid came from, or the bubonic plague came from? Nobody. So I don't blame the Chinese for, you know, kind of shuffling around trying to pretend it didn't happen for a few weeks, because everybody would have done that. But when they did come out with information, it was timely and very detailed. And the part that caught my eye was that patients at risk. Very clear that age was a factor. You started ramping up, up to age 40, wasn't much. Over age 40, it started increasing. Over age 60, it got higher, and over age 70 is when you started the roof. Now, we didn't know why, but age was a risk. there was also comorbidities that was a risk. I mean, they had them on the list. The Chinese had that list out. That's the first thing I saw was that detailed list. Mm-hmm. And, so if you had an immune disease, which is cancer, or type 2 diabetes is really an autoimmune disease, you're at higher risk. Now, there was 1 or 2 outliers like high blood pressure. Why would high blood pressure be a risk? So you have to kind of take a look at that, and it turns out that's important. But that, if you look at just what we had on that day, you could have formulated a response if somebody had communicated it properly. Right. And that's where it was wrong. Literally, if somebody had phoned the right person up and said, what do we do with a coronavirus that affects old people and people with compromised immune systems? And in that patient group probably has a 5 to 10% mortality rate, so we need to be concerned about it. Mm-hmm. What should we do about it? You would have gotten an answer very quickly, very simply. And if that had been communicated properly to our medical community, our politicians, and the population at large, I think this whole thing would have had a very different outcome. But it wasn't. So it's a failure of communication. No, clearly, I don't blame politicians. They were just trying to do what they could do, without understanding, the situation. So you've got all these well-meaning politicians going around doing it looks like random stuff to try to prevent something that might be bad, might not be bad, but they're trying to prevent it. And so they're well-meaning. You get a population that's being scared to death by everything they've heard, all the misinformation that, of course, which is a double layer. I mean, you get all, did you drink bleach or not? Or, there was a bleach shortage in Hawaii, and it turned out it wasn't because people were trying to disinfect their floors or whatever with it, which is actually a good use of bleach. They were actually washing their food in it because somebody came out with something somewhere on some site that's saying washing your food in bleach is a good thing. Well, honestly, I'd rather get coronavirus and eat food than be dipped in bleach. Literally.
Yeah, absolutely.
But there's a whole sequence of those, the misinformation and the rumors and everything else comes out of the fact that it goes right back to that first thing. We didn't communicate it properly. And that it's a failure of communication. This entire situation is literally a failure of communication from the start.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Brad. Let me ask you, just as we wrap up here, just thinking about if you could right now give one piece of advice, say, to your younger self, to someone just starting out in his or her career after getting the Ph.D., what would it be? Or maybe even, just a piece of advice you got along the way that you think would be particularly helpful for someone who is, thinking about entering the biotech industry or early in his or her career.
Yeah, there's a couple of short truisms I think that I would offer up as advice, and I do, because I'm sadly in the kind of old mentor stage in Canada anyway. Which happens at a much earlier age than anywhere else in the world, apparently. But there's so few of us in Canada that are involved in that. People just seek you out. Mm-hmm. And I'm part of the crowd in the United States, and happily part of the crowd in the United States. When I'm in Canada, I'm not part of the crowd. I'm one of the few people who have gone through the whole cycle and done it lots of times, and so I get asked a lot. And the things that I tell people is, there's several of them. One is always tell the truth. Always. I know it sounds kind of grade school stuff, but always tell the truth. It's so easy to try to exaggerate, to an investor in particular, about what you're doing, and they see right through it. And the reason they're investing in you is not what you're talking about. 90% of investment decision is based on assessment of management. Mm-hmm. And so be brutally honest about where you are in the development cycle, what it's going to take to get finished. Don't overestimate it. Don't underestimate it. Don't say, it's going to take us 20 years to do a product if it's going to take you 12. Don't say 3 if it's going to take you to do 12, just because you want people to give you money. Just tell the truth. Pretty straightforward. 2 is that if you want to be in biotech, be prepared for a very rough ride, because despite what brilliant idea you may have come up with, and there are a lot of brilliant people in our industry. Like that's some of the stuff that people come up with in our industry is breathtakingly brilliant. It's unbelievably good stuff. But that doesn't matter as far as Mother Nature is concerned. She's having a bad day. She's going to make your product fail. You can't. You have to develop a very thick skin for failure, because the vast majority of really good ideas that look great in the lab fail in humans. And just be ready for that. It's like, so tell the truth, be ready for failures, and not have a science fiction phone number.
This is a very far out piece of advice that's coming. I can.
Well, that's my ringer, which you can hear 3 blocks away. Again, everybody I know hates that ringer. They think it's all think it's the Halloween ringer, but it's actually a science fiction ringer that got stolen for Halloween because it works for Halloween.
That's great.
So it's very much I mean, those are the and you have to also be willing to work like 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's the kind of standard entrepreneurial kind of advice you'd give to anybody, is that it's not a 9-to-5 job. It's it's time zoneless, it's dayless, it's holidayless, and it's usually not an issue, because virtually everybody I've ever met in this industry is not in it to be a job. They're in it to make a difference, either medically or economically, which in our case usually go hand in hand. There's no vested interest here. I mean, you hear all these rumors about people keeping drugs off the market because they might cure the disease you're after. I've never run into somebody like that, never. Big pharma, little pharma, biotech, these people don't exist, because curing disease is how we make money. So, I mean, it's like, if they're interested in money, they're going to do the same thing if they're interested in curing disease. It's just, it's the best industry for alignment of economic and social interests that I've ever seen in the world. I mean, I started out in the oil industry. My first job, I went, smack dab, fresh Ph.D. in microbiology, immunology, and I went to work for a joint venture in Alberta that was doing heavy oil. And, because that's what Albertans do. And I mean, it was enjoyable, but you're mining fossil carbon. How many different ways can you make mining fossil carbon interesting intellectually? You can't. You can make a lot of money on it, and you can make a big difference by, reducing costs of production and all the other kind of stuff that I was involved in. But I wanted, figuratively, to stick, the derringer in my mouth and pull the trigger after about 6 months, because I was bored to death. And that's the other thing I advise people, is that you're not ever going to be bored in biotech. Like, if you want to be in the biotech industry, I would encourage people to do it just if they want to keep stimulated. Like, you got a kid that's got a 200 and something IQ and is driving you insane because they can't focus on more than one thing at a time for a picosecond. Get them interested in biotech, because they'll be interested in it for forever. So it's a lot of hard work. It's got a very high standard of ethics with respect to telling the truth, and it's just you have to have the thickest skin possible. That'd be my advice.
That's great. Yeah, that's great advice. That's great advice. Dr. Brad Thompson, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us on this episode of When Science Speaks. I really appreciate you being on the show.
Well, thank you.
And listeners, thank you very much thanks for joining us on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you will be back next time for the next episode.
This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.